Hello YouTube, today I'm going to be adding the Bigger Geekier Box and the other promotional factions onto the Smash Up tier list. As always, this video is broken into parts. The first part explains how the tier list is made. I haven't made any changes since the awesome level 9000 video, so if you have watched that one recently, then feel free to skip ahead. It has been ages since I made that video though, so if you've forgotten, feel free to watch it again. This is then followed by each of the factions, in alphabetical order, before concluding with the expansion tier list and the final overall tier list. As always, let me know what you think of the rankings and the tier list down below. These videos generate a lot of discussion and I always really enjoy hearing what everyone has to say. So let's jump straight into it. So how am I going to be making the tier list? Well, in this series I'm going to specifically be looking at factions in isolation across 9 characteristics, which I believe provides a comprehensive overview of most, if not all, of the core game mechanics. These are draw power, burst, control, power gain, action enabling, disruption, recovery, phase 3 and standalone VP. Each characteristic is broken down into 5 levels from none through to maximum, and the reason I've done this is to try and keep it as objective as possible, and I'll be going through a breakdown of the characteristics and the requisite levels over the coming slides. If I made the tier list based on subjective experience, it does start to raise all sorts of problems. So for example, if I played a game with alien zombies and I won before my opponents even managed to get to 5 victory points each, I might then believe that the aliens and the zombies as a combination or as factions individually are S tier. You can then legitimately say, well, how good are you at the game? How good were your opponents? How well did you draw? How well did your opponents draw? What were your opponents playing? What was the player count for the game? All of these things shape how the game plays out, and these factors are very variable. Additionally, while a pairing might be unreal, the best smash-up pairing you could possibly have, it doesn't necessarily tell you how good or bad a particular faction is. It's only by considering the strengths and weaknesses of a faction and blending those with the strengths and weaknesses of another faction that you can find good pairings. So let's take aliens as an example. They have no draw power and no recovery. If you can strengthen either or both of these things, then you're almost certainly going to have a good pairing with the aliens. If you stick them with the zombies, for instance, the best recovery faction in the game, boom, you've got yourself a winning pairing. So hopefully by keeping it as objective as possible and by considering each faction only on its own merits, this will give the tier list as much credibility as possible. Inevitably, it is going to throw up some surprises and some things that I'm sure you will disagree with me on. You'll also see a score there in the middle. Each level within a characteristic is assigned a score. That's how I came to the overall positioning for the faction. These aren't weighted. The issue with weighting is how do you make comparisons between each characteristic. So for instance, recovery, when playing against the Sharks, might be incredibly important, but in another matchup where your opponent can't really affect your cards, recovery might be less important, and draw power might be more important. Additionally, one or a combination of characteristics is embedded within the theme and balancing of each faction. Finally, as I mentioned before, Smash Up is a game of combinations, and while we're looking at each faction individually and assessing their strengths and weaknesses in a vacuum, the pairing you get is such a significant part of the game in complementing strengths and mitigating weaknesses. So for all those reasons, it became too difficult to consider weighting the characteristics because actually their importance changes from game to game. Finally, you'll see a rating on the slide about how complex I believe the faction is to play. This isn't scored, this is just to help you when considering if you want to give this faction to newer players, for instance. So the first characteristic is draw power, and this one is fairly self-explanatory. It's the ability of the faction to be able to draw or search for additional cards from their deck, beyond the 2 cards that you draw at the end of every turn. There are some cards which could fit into more than one characteristic, but that's primarily because I've tried to break characteristics down into many areas as possible. So let's say for instance the hoverbot for the robots, which lets you look at the top card of your deck. If it's a minion, you can play it as an extra minion. While the hoverbot does draw a card from the deck, I'll be classing that as burst rather than draw power. Likewise, the Shinobi can be played as an extra minion play during phase 3, I'll be classing that as phase 3 rather than burst. If I wasn't considering phase 3 as its own characteristic, then I would class it as burst. However, the more characteristics there are, the more diverse this will be, and the more opportunities there'll be for the faction's strengths and weaknesses to show through. There are some exceptions to this where a card does genuinely fit into more than one characteristic, so for instance abduction for the aliens. These 2 effects are independent of each other, so the first part can be used to bounce an opponent's minion to hand, which is control, and then you can play an extra minion, which is burst, so the effects are independent. For characteristics like this, which are fairly simple and there's not really much to explain, I won't be dwelling on the slide, so if you do want to read what each level does, then just pause the video. So burst, what do I mean by that? Well, as Smash Up is a game of breaking bases, burst is the ability to play more than one minion in a turn. Looking at the level, a faction with no burst has no way of playing any extra minions beyond their standard 1 minion per turn. At the other end of the spectrum, a faction with maximum burst can potentially break a base in a single turn, or they can drop an insurmountable amount of power in one turn, which means they effectively lock up first place on the base. Control is one that does have overlap with Disruption, however I think they are distinct enough to categorise them as two separate things, and I'll attempt to explain how. I consider Control to be ways of directly influencing your opponent's minions, so this is things like destroying minions, returning minions to hand, moving minions, returning minions to your opponent's deck, and other things like that. Smash Up is obviously a game about breaking bases to victory, and to do this you need to use minions, and while there will be some niche exceptions to this rule, so for instance the Kaiju, you can't always cover every circumstance with something as general as a tier list like this. Disruption, however, is more indirect. It might be a random effect, for instance. It doesn't necessarily deal with your opponent's minions, so this will be things like discarding cards, blocking bases' abilities, discarding bases, destroying actions in play, changing the power of minions, and other things like that. It is a very fine line, and I do understand if you may be struggling to see the distinction between the two, but hopefully this and future videos will help. Often factions that are good at Control are good at Disruption, but not in every case. Power gain is a self-explanatory one. It's simply the ability of a faction to be able to gain power in a temporary or permanent way. This is an interesting one because extra actions are really split into two things. There are restricted and unrestricted extra action plays. Unrestricted extra action plays simply give you an extra action. They aren't limited to certain types of actions, there's not another condition attached like being the strongest minion at a base or destroying one of your own minions. These are obviously the best type of extra actions. Restricted extra actions are like the ones I was just mentioning, but there's a conditionality clause attached, but also where the extra action is limited to a play on base or play on minion action. The Baboon for the Cyborg Apes is a really good example of this. The Baboon allows you to play a very specific type of action as an extra action each turn, and it's limited to them being played only on Baboon, so it is a very restricted type of extra action. So this is the other side of the coin to Control. I won't reiterate what I covered on the Control side, instead hopefully I'll be able to make it clearer that Control and Disruption are two separate things. Let's take a look at the alien card Jam Signal. Jam Signal allows you to play it on a base, and all other players ignore the base's ability. Now the reason I wouldn't consider this to be a Control card is firstly it's not directly influencing minions on the board, and secondly there is an element of randomness to it. Even if you know all the bases in the base deck in the game that you're playing in, let's say you've identified one base that would be really good for your opponent. There's no guarantee that you'll see that base in the game. Therefore, it's only a bonus for your opponent if it actually appears, but they aren't relying on it to execute their faction's combination strategy. Therefore, it can't be considered to be a controlling card. Bases are always complementary to a faction's strategy and not integral to it. Control to me is very deliberate. It's reacting to something your opponent's already done, influencing minions on the board as I've already said. Disruption is just more annoying, it might be more random, it can affect your opponent before they get a chance to do something, for instance. Recovery, again, is another straightforward one. This is the ability of the faction to be able to recover or access cards from their discard pile. What do I mean by Phase 3? Well, Phase 3 is quite simply the third step of a turn, which is the base scoring phase, so immediately after you've played your cards for turn. Standalone VP is the ability of a faction to score victory points independently of bases. Bases are the only way for most factions to score victory points, and having other ways is actually quite rare, and even when they do, there's almost certainly some condition attached. These are quite detailed complexity levels. I won't read them out here, but feel free to pause it or give it a read. A faction doesn't need to do all the things listed in the level to be considered that difficulty, it's just really a guide for the type of things that can be considered.
So we're starting with the Geeks, one of the most interesting and divisive factions in Smash Up. For draw power, I've rated them as a medium for having 5 cards in the 4 fans and mulligan that control them extra cards. Starting with the fans, unless you're absolutely desperate for a minion play, or you need 2 power to break a base, you'll only ever use the fan for its special. And it's not just a 1 card draw 1, which would be a pretty weak effect. It's better than that because it doesn't cost you your action or minion play to do that effect. With the fans, you can think of the Geek faction as only 16 cards big rather than 20, as the fans are just a free cycle into your better cards, of which the Geeks do have plenty. So fan is actually quite a good draw card. Mulligan is reminiscent of Winds of Change from the Wizards. It's not as good as Winds of Change as you don't get the action back, but it does have its advantages. You draw before shuffling your hand in, which means that you're guaranteed not to see any of the cards that are in your hand. The chances are that if you're considering playing Mulligan, it's because your hand isn't very good, so being guaranteed a completely fresh hand is certainly better than Winds of Change. The dream scenario is obviously if Mulligan is your only card in hand, then it's a straight draw 5, which is incredible card draw, but for a faction that wants to see as many of its cards as quickly as it can because of how strong some of them are, this is a welcome addition. This is a worthy medium. The Geeks have to go down as a weak for burst. The reason being is that they're incredibly dependent on your opponents. Wil Wheaton should only be played as an extra minion when your opponent plays an action that you want to block. The problem with this is that might not happen when you want it to happen, so you could be sitting with Wil Wheaton for quite a while and then have to use the extra minion play he grants suboptimally, when you'd rather have had 4 power earlier on in the game, for instance. There's no doubt that Wil Wheaton is an incredibly strong card, but it's very weak in the context of burst. Control minion, just the special here. Again, this is a tenuous one, as the extra minion play you get is actually your opponent's minion for that turn, so you're only typically doing this when the base that minion's been played onto is breaking, or when they have an incredibly strong on-play ability that you want. As with Wil Wheaton, this is entirely dictated by your opponent, which makes Control minion a weak burst card. Now when you think of the Geeks, the first thing that probably comes to mind is Control, so you'll probably be surprised to see just 3 cards here and a medium rating. I would argue that the Geeks are less about control and more annoyance, which in this tier list you'll see shine through in Disruption. Spoilers. We'll start with the Griefer, which is the weakest control card of the 3. Griefer is on the slide for the second choice of the 3 available choices, destroying a minion. This is definitely control, but it is very weak. It's not often that I choose this option, as the choice of which minion to destroy is entirely up to your opponent. They may have a minion that's invulnerable to destruction. It's likely that it'll have more than 1 minion in play, and at least one of those minions will be from the lowest minion tier, so a dispensable power 2 minion for example, which wouldn't really be a big loss to them. Unless there is a perfect opportunity, like the first turn for example where your opponent is led off by playing their king minion, it's very unlikely that you'll choose this effect. Control minion, which we've already seen, is a very solid card that provides the flexibility of using it proactively or reactively. There's no power cap or restriction on this card, so take any other minion so long as it can be affected. Whether you want to use this on your turn to take a big King Rex and break a base, or if you want to use it as a counter to a Shinobi to stop a first place steal for example, this card is incredibly flexible and strong. Finally, the big one, Felicia Day, arguably one of the strongest minions in the entire game. This card has such a high power ceiling, it's impossible to overstate just how good this card actually is. It acts as an entire board reset. Are you behind on every single base? Why not move every minion to 1 base so that your opponents have massively and inefficiently overpaid and overcommitted for their positions, and you've maybe only played Felicia Day to secure 2nd or 3rd place. If you have a base out such as a ninja base and the card is even better and more punishing for your opponents, mass movement is a very rare mechanic, and it's usually limited to just 1 base, so to have a global mass movement mechanic is absolutely absurd. You could arguably increase the rating to strong just off the back of Felicia Day alone, but I think medium is fair for 3 very different effects. The Geeks have no way of increasing the power of their minions. It's another week for the Geeks for action enabling, and I'm not even sure if you can count non-infinite loop as an extra action card, it's quite unique, so let's start with that one. Non-infinite loop does let you play an extra action, however you could play the action anyway. What it does do however is let you put the action back into your hand, so that you can play it again next turn or at another point in the future. So it lets you play the same action twice. It's almost as if the card reads special, play after you play an action, put that action back into your hand. It just front loads that effect via an extra action play. It feels quite strange to be talking about it for this characteristic, but it does grant you an extra action play, and conversely to the description for weak, it can't really be a play on minion or base action, as you wouldn't really want to return them to your hand except for rare circumstances. Then we have min-maxing, which is quite a random effect. The Geeks don't really have a non-committal way to look at another player's hand in advance of doing an effect such as this. The other card that they have is Banned List that lets you look at another player's hand, and in both instances the turn that you look at their hand is the turn you want to do the effect, so it is quite random. You could obviously follow one after the other which would work, but the first one you do would still be a random effect. Min-maxing does let you play an unrestricted extra action, and it lets you access effects that you would never normally have access to. However, it is incredibly conditional on what your opponent has in their hand. You may miss an action entirely, you may hit something bad, or worse that hurts you in some way, so I can't really give Geeks a higher rating than weak here for extra actions. And now onto the big one, for Disruption. This is what the Geeks are known for. They have a lot of Disruption cards and a lot of very good Disruption cards too, so this is definitely a worthy maximum for me. Wil Wheaton, we've already talked about this card just a little bit. Actions are half the game in Smash Up, and if you've seen my break in the All-Star series, there are some incredibly strong actions in the game. The power level of some factions are entirely dependent on one single action in the deck, so the ability to completely negate an action play is incredibly strong, and also very frustrating, but possibly even game-winning there and then. And the fact that Geeks also have Force of Will so they can do it twice in a game is just simply amazing. The Game Gurus are immune to pretty much everything apart from base abilities. You can play one onto a base and almost guarantee that it'll stay there no matter what and get you some victory points. Min-maxing I just talked about on the last characteristic, but similar to Wil Wheaton, if you can hit a key combo piece from the hand and break apart their game plan, or hit something to accelerate your path to victory, that is very disruptive. 2 copies of Rules Lawyer gives you good counter cards to play on minions or play on base factions, letting you move them around to break up their strategy or even steal the play on minion actions if they're quite good. Griefer again, I've already touched on the destructive effect in the controlling slide. The other 2 effects of discarding a card or shuffling the discard pile back into the deck. The latter effect is a good counter to factions that utilise the discard pile, the main offender being the zombies of course, and the former effect is just really for annoyance, but again, like min-maxing, you may hit something good at random from this card. The power of this card though is that you can choose an effect for each player, so you can tailor the ability for each matchup. Finally, 2 copies of Banlist. Now, as I mentioned on the previous characteristic with min-maxing, unless you've played min-maxing before this card, or you know that your opponent has a particular minion in hand, let's say they've just returned a minion from play into the hand, it is going to be luck based. I think I've had far more times than not when playing this card without any advanced knowledge that you will guess wrong and not place anything onto the bottom of your opponent's deck. When you do hit something however, placing on the bottom of the deck for 99% of factions is a death sentence. They may never see that card again throughout the course of the game. Think about the aliens who have no card draw. If you hit both invaders with this card and you put them to the bottom of the deck, you probably just won the game there and then, because without the invaders, whatever combination they're with is significantly weaker, unless it's granny aliens. So yeah, some incredibly strong and unique effects here, and anyone who's played against the Geeks will agree that they are a very disruptive faction to play against, an archetypal maximum. The Geeks have no recovery cards. The Geeks have no Phase 3 plays, or do they? All 3 of these cards can be played in Phase 3, however you are reacting to your opponents, you can't proactively play them in Phase 3, so it is matchup based and entirely dependent on what your opponents are doing, so I'm not going to give them any credit here. Finally, this is a tough one for me as it is borderline weak, and by strict definition it should by rights sit in weak. However, I couldn't call this a weak standalone VP card. If you compare this to Shady Deal, the ghost card that requires you to have 2 or fewer cards in hand to gain a VP, that is much more conditional than this. Granted, you can't just play this whenever you like, but I can guarantee you that at least once during the game you will gain a victory point. You're very likely to do this several times during a game, and you can simply play this card when you do. It's a very easy condition to fulfill. The Geeks are a hard faction to play, and I absolutely would not give this faction to newer players. The Geeks specialise in having a toolbox of cards to counter almost every faction. Their strongest cards, so Felicia Day, Wil Wheaton, Force of Will and Banlist, all require an in-depth understanding of the game, so to know each faction, card counts, the optimal action, the optimal minion to target, when to play Felicia Day for maximum impact. While they're quite a standard play one minion, play one action faction, the sheer uniqueness of the faction and the in-depth knowledge of the game you need to play them gives them a hard complexity rating for me. On to pairings now, and this one was quite tricky. The Geeks don't really have any obvious synergistic pairings. They do their own thing, which is counter with factions, so you could pick almost anything to go with the Geeks and you'll do fine. There is one obvious strong pairing though, and I hate to do it, but it is the zombies. The zombies have so many ways of recycling your 2 best minions in Felicia Day and Wil Wheaton. There are a couple of less obvious synergies though. The first one is that you can play Not Enough Bullets to return your 4 fans to hand, so that Not Enough Bullets essentially becomes a straight draw 4, which is an amazing card effect. Also, you can discard your fans quickly and then replay them later for free with the Zombie Lord. If you combo this with They Keep Coming to play Felicia Day, then you can, in a 4-player game, move the 4 fans to create a 17 power drop in 1 turn. Combined with anyone else's power, that should be enough to win any base. This is a very strong and oppressive pairing. For the fun pairing, and this is just me because I'm a bit of a sadist, but if you like your friendships then I wouldn't recommend this pairing, but I would pair the Geeks with the other faction known for disruption and trolling, which are the Vikings. Not only can you block your opponent's actions, but you can also steal their minions. The strength of this pairing, and you wouldn't think this, but it actually comes from Cast the Runes. This is the card you absolutely want to use non-infinite loop on. I've talked during the characteristics about min-maxing and Banlist, and how if you can see the player's hand first before playing one of these cards, the power of the card goes up dramatically. Well, Cast the Runes allows you to see their hand as well as their next draws before playing Banlist or min-maxing for maximum effect. If you enjoy watching your opponent suffer, then this is the pairing for you.
Penguins are up next, and this is the first time you'll see a Titan featured for a faction, because the Penguins were released with a Titan, it wasn't a posthumous edition, and as you'll see, a couple of their cards reference the Titan. Penguins are a really interesting one. They have an inherent inconsistency built into the faction through benefits from playing minions randomly off the top of the deck, but it's not completely random as you might expect. They do have mitigations inbuilt into the faction, 2 of which are on this slide. We'll start with Pebble Gift. This is the ideal first card for any base you intend to play on. The Penguins have a lot of extra plays off the top of the deck, and if you can get Emperor Penguin into play, you can play a minion off the top of the deck every single turn. Combo this with I Can't Tell Them Apart, which you'll see later, then you can easily draw 3 to 5 cards from this card, or even more before the base scores. Ice Slide is reminiscent of Tech Center for the robots in its level of draw. Like the robots, the Penguins are a swarm faction, they go big on one base at a time, and with all their extra plays you can easily have 4 or more minions on the base before it breaks. Ice Slide is very regularly a card that draws lots of cards, which like Tech Center for the robots, is essential to help refill your hand. Swarm factions can be very good at getting it to a certain point in the game very quickly, and then grinding to a halt because you haven't been able to cycle through the deck fast enough just to keep up with everybody else. So it's cards like Ice Slide which help to keep that early game momentum and pressure. Regurgitating Penguin is one of the few actual deck manipulation cards the Penguins have, which is obviously great for a faction that plays off the top of the deck. The Penguins also have a lot of extra minion plays, so your deck is likely to always have more actions than minions in it at any one time, which means this card, although it only reveals 3 cards, is likely to have at least 1 valid target. The good thing about this card is, even if you have no actions on your top 3 cards, you do get to reorder the minions, so let's imagine that Snazzy Penguin was there, you can put him directly on top and play a hatching to immediately play it off the top of the deck for maximum value. You get really useful information even if you miss with Regurgitating Penguin, so it's a great addition to the faction. I just mentioned Snazzy Penguin, so let's turn to it next. A draw 2, if you play it off the top of your deck, is obviously amazing. We've got Puck for the Smash Up All-Stars later, which for the same minion power allows for a consistent draw 1, and that is also a very solid card. Now obviously it is a bit random, there are no guarantees you'll hit off the top of the deck, but as I mentioned there are mitigations, one of which is the other card we haven't yet talked about on the slide, which is Secret Mission. Now this is an amazing card in the Penguins, and possibly a very underrated card. It helps to smooth out the randomness. You may be looking at it and thinking, well, it's a net neutral card draw, you get no extra cards from it. And yes, it allows you to refresh your hand, but more importantly, it allows you to put minions on the bottom of your deck which you want in your deck, so that they can be played off the top, such as Snazzy Penguin. And you can keep those cards in your hand like Actions and Dancing Penguin and maybe your partner faction's minions that you want in your hand, not clogging up your deck. And because you play them onto the bottom, you're guaranteed not to redraw them when you draw. While this doesn't gain you any extra cards, it is an amazing card in the faction, and Penguins are a worthy strong. I mentioned earlier about Penguins being a swarm faction, and like the robots they are an archetypal maximum burst faction. Let's start with the Command Penguin and the 2 hatchings. This is a really solid ability that gives you a free extra minion play off the top of the deck, and yes, there is an element of randomness about what you might hit, but as we've seen from some of the Penguin minions, they want to be played off the top of the deck for greater value, so there's an upside there compared to a conventional extra minion play. And as I mentioned in draw power, Penguins aren't just an RNG faction, they do have ways through Dancing Penguin, Emperor Penguin, Secret Mission to smooth out that look, and more consistently over time get your deck full of minions that want to be played, and your hand full of stuff that doesn't. Talking of Emperor Penguin, let's turn to it next. Why is it even on the slide? It doesn't give you any extra plays, in fact it says on it instead of your regular play. The reason I've classed this as burst is that it almost guarantees you a minion play every single turn. As long as you have minions at power 3 or less in your hand or discard, which is very likely, you can always play a minion off the top of your deck every turn. It is a guaranteed minion play, and even better, it's off the top of your deck, which as we've seen the Penguins want to do, and this card is one of the main engines for top of the deck plays. So it's not technically burst, but it always enables a minion play from the top of the deck, which is key to the faction's strategy. The Baby Penguin, this is the minion you're most likely to hit off the top of your deck, as you've got 4 copies. This is the minion in the faction that gives you a conventional extra minion play from hand, and its minions are power 3 or less, which captures most of the minions in a standard faction. Penguins have the Surfing Penguin and Disguised Penguin, which are a good target for this card, but you're mainly using Baby Penguin to get your partner faction's minions into play, to free up your hand space for action cards, so that as I've said you can start to smooth out your whole engine. Disguised Penguin, this is a great way of providing extra reach on a base. The later in the game you can play it, the better, when you have more idea about the possible targets that this minion can hit. It serves a few purposes. If you need to reach for more power on a base, you can simply try to hit a high power minion with the card, or you can aim for a baby penguin to then play an extra minion of power 3 or less from your hand. And it also plays into Pebble Gift, so regardless of whatever you hit, you'll get to draw a card. So even if you replace 3 power with 3 power and nothing's changed, you've drawn a card from it, and you've put a minion into your deck that you don't mind hitting off the top of your deck. If you have lots of great on-play abilities in your partner faction, and you don't really mind what you hit, then again, it's another way of trying to access one of those abilities. This is a surprisingly important card in the faction. Under the Ice, this is certainly the weakest burst card on the slide, but in situations where you just need an extra minion play and you don't really mind what it is, then it can be helpful. It's the top 5 cards, and similar to Regurgitating Penguin on the last slide, in an ideal world you should hit 2.5 minions when playing it, or like Regurgitating Penguin, you'd be unlucky not to hit a valid target. The problem is this is a random minion, so you'll have to pick randomly if you have multiple possible targets, and then you place the other cards under the bottom of your deck. And while that's not as big an issue for the Penguins with how much shuffling you have, if there was a card there that you did want to draw and you would have drawn it in the next turn or so, well, it's really up in the air as to when you'll next actually draw it. So this is definitely the weakest card. Leaping Aboard, I'll talk about more in the Phase 3 characteristic, but it gives you a head start on the next base which may trigger an extra play, and it also helps to get Emperor Penguin back into play quicker. Finally, I can't tell them apart. You might be thinking what the point of this card is, as you play the same number of minions as you shuffle back in, so it's a net 0, but this card is super strong. Again, it plays into Pebble Gift, but for a ridiculous draw this time, potentially drawing you 3 or more cards. But remember, the Penguins' play off the top abilities are really strong. As soon as they're in play though, you can't use that ability again. So this often isn't a net 0 for burst. Imagine if you choose a base that has Command Penguin, 2 Baby Penguins and Snazzy Penguin, and you shuffle those 4 minions into the deck. Now let's imagine you only hit Baby Penguin and Command Penguin and 2 of your partner faction's minions. You've still drawn 4 cards through Pebble Gift, then you can play an extra minion with Baby Penguin from your hand, and play another off the top of the deck with Command Penguin for another extra draw. So I Can't Tell Them Apart was draw 5 cards, play 6 minions, but only shuffling 4 back in. The card is crazy, it's an amazing burst faction. Control now and Penguins are a weak for control. Surfing Penguin is actually quite a solid card. 1 card with universal movement for you or your opponents is really flexible, and it's a great addition to the toolbox that the Penguins have. But this is only 1 effect, 1 time, and it moves the minion away, rather than being able to move a minion to the base, which is what you're more likely to want to do with movement. Power gain now, and this is a close call for me with medium. Emperor Penguin is here for its talent, which you want to be doing every single turn. The problem is that Emperor Penguin has to be played on a base where you've got 3 or more minions, so you don't get very many uses before the base breaks, as you keep adding power there with Emperor Penguin, as well as adding minions to that base each turn. You'll typically get 1 to 3 power counters before it goes, which is okay. The reason I said you don't get very long out of Emperor Penguin is unless you're absolutely desperate and you don't have much on board or in hand, and you need to start chaining off the top of the deck again, you'll almost never want to be using a Wish for Wings That Work to play Emperor Penguin. We've already seen that Penguins are a big swarm faction. They get lots of minions onto one base at a time, and although the minions are quite low power, a Wish for Wings That Work helps to provide a big buff to lock up first place on the base. Realistically, you could have 5 or more minions on a base, which makes the power boosts from this card really good, to either not have to commit any more minions, or to help to protect against your opponent trying to steal the base in Phase 3. If you wanted to increase power gain to medium off the back of this card, I wouldn't blame you. Finally, I put Dancing Penguin on the slide as it can be used if you played a minion at random off the top of your deck, and you've hit a power 2 for example. You can play Dancing Penguin instead to give you essentially a 2 power boost. You generally use Dancing Penguin though to put a minion into your deck that you'd rather play off the top of your deck, or to mitigate against a bad hit off the top of the deck. So unless you really need the extra power to break a base, you're unlikely to use it for that purpose. It's a good week though. The Penguins have no way of playing extra actions, and they have no way of disrupting the opponent. Just the Emperor Penguin for recovery, and it meets the description for week well. Most of the time you'll be accessing the discard pile rather than the hand, but it's not every time. And you shuffle the minion into your deck, which would usually be quite weak, but as we've seen that's exactly what the Penguins want to be doing. Phase 3, and I've already mentioned Leaping Aboard. The problem with Swarm factions is that the momentum very quickly dissipates. You can win a couple of early bases, and then you're struggling for draws and extra plays and everyone else catches up and then eventually moves ahead. Leaping Aboard is great for keeping the momentum going. If you hit a Baby Penguin you can potentially then play another minion from your hand, and you're already 2 minions up on the new base. This plays well into getting the Emperor Penguin back into play. Ice Slide, as I've already mentioned, is absolutely amazing. I've just talked about Momentum, and this card is basically a draw 4 or more cards. And even better, because it happens during phase 3 on your or your opponent's turns, you can then draw those cards before the start of your next turn, so that you have a full hand again to begin the next chain. The only issue with both of these cards are that they are play on base, and they need to be played in advance of being used. This leaves them vulnerable to action removal, but the cards, particularly Ice Slide, need to have a downside to be balanced. Penguins have no way of gaining victory points independently of bases. The complexity for Penguins is low. At its core, it's a very simple strategy which is easy for any new player to grasp. You play minions off the top of the deck, and you play them all onto the same base. The beauty of the faction though is that there is more to it, and when you play them more there is a strategy there. It would be incorrect to call them an entirely luck-based faction. They do have plays in Secret Mission, Dancing Penguin, Disguise Penguin, Emperor Penguin to get your hand set and your deck set, so that you have exactly what you want in both places to then mitigate the randomness. If every target in your deck is good to hit, it doesn't really matter what you hit. Now for the strongest pairing, I regularly alternate as to what I actually think that is. For the purpose of this video though, I've settled on Mythic Horses, who are another strong Swarm faction. The Pinkies are great extra plays from hand, always coming into play as a power 3 off your baby penguins, to help mitigate the below average power of the penguin minions. Sea Star is an even better play from hand, allowing for a further uncapped extra minion play. Rainbow gives you more reliable card draw, and Starlight is just a massive finisher, regularly hitting 8 or more power. Adventure Power allows you to sweep in and move all your minions to another base, similar to a Full Sail style effect. Encouragement Power acts like an ongoing augmentation, and Super Future Space Armor, wow, this card is absolutely insane, allowing for double base breaks in a single turn. They've even more card draw and extra plays, as well as another really useful special which lets you play an extra minion off the top of your deck, which is exactly what the Penguins want to be doing. I often debate whether the Robots or Russian Fairy Tales are the better pairing, but I think I'm fairly set now that Mythic Horse Penguins is the optimal pairing. Finally, for the fun pairing, I've gone with Penguin Vigilantes, which is a great image to imagine. Now yes, this is a pairing that Baby Penguin loses a lot of value, however there are some really interesting upsides. Dusty Henry and Knocked Into Next Week allows you to shuffle one of your own minions back into the deck so it has dual use. Shift lets you stack the top of your deck with a minion that you potentially want to play immediately off the top. Stoneford helps you to grab a really powerful action exactly when you want it, such as Pebble Gift. Tough It Out can give your penguins extra power to play into the excellent card drawer Who Loves Your Baby. In general, Vigilantes add more toolbox options to an already toolbox style faction in the penguins. This one is definitely surprising and a fun pairing, and it's one that probably shouldn't work, but does. Sheep now, and looking at draw power. I have them down as medium, which I think is fair, as Shearing is the only card that gives them reliable card draw every single turn. You Shall Pass and To Follow or Not do draw you a card, but you don't play them with that purpose in mind. You play them when it's right to trigger the primary effect, so playing a random action or moving one of your minions. The card draw is just a nice secondary bonus. Shearing, however, you can play every single turn and reliably draw yourself a card each time. The downside to this, however, is you drop the power of one of your minions by 2. This can be an upside. If you want to play down a Flock for instance but not add any power to the base yet, then you drop the Shearing straight onto it. Most of the time, however, this is going to be a downside though, as you don't generally want to weaken your own minions. Playing on a Black Sheep for instance can then drop the power to a range where many more destruction effects become live, so this is a fair medium for me. The Sheep have no way of playing extra minions, or at least certainly no consistent and reliable way. While To Follow or Not and Wood for Sheep could get you anything in theory, they're incredibly inconsistent and matchup based cards, and if I'm trying to be objective here, which I am, I couldn't in good faith include them. Medium here for Sheep, and similar to the Geeks rating being carried by Felicia Day, this rating is mostly attributable to On the Lam. I mentioned about how good mass movement mechanics are, and while this isn't on the same level as Felicia Day, you can still create some huge tempo plays with this card. For potentially just one of your minions, you can land second place, while moving all of your opponent's minions in a 2-player game to the base where they potentially already have other minions, and making them inefficiently overpay for first place points. If that base is an unfavourable VP spread for the winner, say a ninja base or a 2-2 or 3-3 base, then it gets even stronger, so this card is excellent. Onto the supporting cast now. So Little Bo Peep is an insanely good card against a small number of movement heavy factions, where denying them a base to move to can be incredibly strong, especially if they have movement specials. Most of the time though, you might get a small amount of utility from this card, blocking 1 or 2 cards for instance in your opponent's faction and on that specific base, so it's very minor. In Sheep's Clothing is a versatile card that can be played on your or your opponent's minions. If you play it on an opposing minion, you can potentially utilise their power to help you break a base, as well as removing a dangerous threat from the board. With the amount of movement the sheep have, it's an easy effect to trigger and control. Finally, 2 copies of Ram. This is quite a minor controlling effect. While returning a minion is an anti-tempo play, imagine returning a Tenacious Z to hand for instance, it is a very low impact play a lot of the time, because Power 2 minions in most matchups don't have a significant effect on the board state. Most factions have 4 copies of the Power 2 minion and they're generally quite weak. So there are 2 different effects here, but I think medium is fair. Sheep have just the 1 card that can increase their power, in Counting Sheep, but this is a truly awful card. Yes, it can give a lot of minions on a base plus 1 power buff, which could be the difference between winning and losing the base or even breaking the base, but this card is entirely out of your control and in the hands of your opponent. While it's quite likely that you're playing against at least 1 faction that can increase the power of their minions, that's not a guarantee. So this card could be dead immediately. The last thing you want to be doing is picking a partner faction that can increase the power of another player's minions. That's incredibly weak and potentially even detrimental to your game. Even worse though is your opponent decides when the power increase activates. So they can specifically wait for the exact time to trigger it, and most of the time that'll be when Counting Sheep power increase doesn't even matter. So this is an incredibly weak. Action enabling now, and we've already seen You Shall Pass and To Follow or Not on the first slide, but I'll cover them again here. For You Shall Pass, again like the card draw, the extra action is a nice secondary effect, and probably not why you're playing the card in the first place. It is an unrestricted extra action play though, and it combos nicely with the card draw to give you more options. To Follow or Not is weak though. You're trying to target this when your opponent has exactly 1 amazing action in the discard pile, but most of the time you have to randomly pick from several actions and it's not a card or outcome that can be relied upon. Yes, sometimes you do high roll into something absolutely insane, but most of the time you won't. The best thing you can say about this card is that if your opponents know the sheep deck, then it may stop them from playing some of the best actions early in the game, so as not to play into this card, which may hinder their game plan. Finally, Hello Dolly, and this is a strange one as it's not really an extra action play, but it sort of is, because it can be any action in the game. It is a card like Bandlist that requires an in-depth knowledge of the game, and all of the actions in every faction, so that you know as soon as your opponents have picked their factions exactly what the optimal actions are to hit with Hello Dolly. So yes, it is action enabling as it does give you any action, but again, like Counting Sheep, it is conditional on when your opponents decide to play it, and also having any additional pieces in hand ready for when they do decide to play it. So for example, if you want to copy Ghostly Arrival, not only is it unknown when it might be played, but also you need to make sure that you have the action and a minion in hand that you want to utilise with the effect. A tricky card certainly, but a card with a huge potential power ceiling. So the sheep get a week on Disruption. Like some of the other cards, this is another one that's plagued by randomness. I have classed it as Disruption because you are guaranteed to take a card if you do want to. No matter what you hit, it's a card in their deck, so presumably it has some kind of synergy and value to at least one of the 2 factions in their deck. But again, it's random and you can hit gold with this, but you can also hit garbage as well. And because it is a random card, there's not even a way that you could look at the hand first and target the exact card you want, although obviously the prior knowledge of their hand would help determine whether you want to play this card in the first place. So again, this is another very weak rating for the sheep. Finally, sheep have no recovery, no cards that can be played in phase 3, not counting Hello Dolly for the same reason I didn't count Will Wheaton, and also they have no way of scoring victory points independently of bases. Sheep are a really interesting faction. The compulsory movement, however, makes them a tricky faction to play. They also have a number of effects that are either random or entirely dependent on your opponent, or both. It's a faction where you're playing 80% of the faction and your opponents are playing the other 20%. It seems to be a case of hope the chaos on your opponent's turn doesn't mean that your flock and black sheep score bases that you weren't targeting, and then putting it all right on your own turn. They don't have a lot of extra plays and sequencing issues, but how they actually play may leave a lot of players scratching their heads. Personally, I'm not a fan. I don't let that influence my ratings, but it all just feels a little bit out of my control for my liking. Just the one faction this time, the reason being that I've only played sheep a handful of times and none of those pairings I felt were ridiculously good or ridiculously fun. However, I did reach out to the Smash Up Facebook community, and both Tornadoes and Explorers came up a few times for the best possible pairing. After looking at both, I felt that the Explorers had the edge here, as there were a few more tools up their sleeves. The first one being that What Were We Thinking, the expansion the explorers are in, have two good bases for the sheep. Lake Minnetonka, with all the movement you have, is great for powering up your converging swarm, and Under the Bed is useful for extra minion plays which the sheep really do need. So with explorers you're guaranteed these two bases in the base deck, and you do obviously have ways to manipulate the base deck, but anyway, the faction themselves and what they bring, well, they add more movement cards to make sure that you always have one available when you need one. The payoff you get from the explorers are the guides, which can act as a huge power boost and can enable multi-base breaks in a single turn. I Said No Camels is a great permanent buff. You want to be targeting the flock with this card, as the intention is to keep them in play for at least a couple of bases. You can do that with You Call This Archaeology, where you can move another minion off the base after winning it, move it to another base and the flock go with it. If the flock have a power counter each, and +1 power from the guide, you potentially moved a significant amount of power to another base. With this faction you do also have a Titan in Very Large Boulder. This can be a blessing and a curse, as you potentially can end up destroying your own minions, so you will have to play smart with this card, but it can act like a really strong version of the flock, and it does also mix some destruction and control into your pairing. Lost City can give you a couple of extra plays which the sheep do want, as well as favourably manipulating the base deck. And finally, Idaho Smith can give you the potential for a solo base break. So I can see that this pairing would certainly be a very strong one, and it's one that I do want to try out when I can play Smash Up again with friends. Smash Up All-Stars now, and this is a faction that gave me a lot of problems. They have a few characteristics that could go up or down a level, and they're very close calls. I'll point those out and you'll see which side of the line I do ultimately decide to fall on, but I could completely agree placing them on the other side of the line as well. Starting at draw power, and we've already seen the fan for the Geeks earlier in the video, just to reiterate briefly what I said there, you're always playing this as a special. It's a free draw and it helps to cycle through your deck to the better cards. Now I put Granny on the slide, but it isn't actually a draw card. Granny's talent doesn't draw you any cards each turn, but the reason I've included it is because Granny improves the quality of your draws every single turn it's in play. Now the All-Stars aren't a faction that can play into deck manipulation or can access the bottom of the deck for example, but what you're doing with Granny is assessing your current situation. Okay, how useful is Sprout for instance for me now if I draw it at the end of this turn? Not very useful, well I'll put it to the bottom of the deck and guarantee I don't draw into it. By removing a bad card, you're improving the quality of the cards you might draw into. So Granny, not a draw card, but a really good card to improve the quality of your draw. On to Puck next, and what a great flexible minion. Drawing a card isn't as strong as playing an extra action I'd say, so I tend to use this card more for the extra play, but the option is there. Prepare for Battle is a souped up Granny talent basically. Rather than look at one and return it to your deck, you're looking at two and drawing one and putting the other to the bottom of the deck. And the same line of thought applies, what's the most useful card to you right now? And you'll be unlucky if you hit two equally useful cards because you're condemning the other one to a place where you may not see it again. It's not a great card draw by any means, but it can be useful in a pinch. The big ones now, Imperial Dragon and Square Deal. On Square Deal, I actually mentioned this in our latest discussion video, but it's a card that doesn't scale through the player count well. The more players there are, the more variance there is, and the less opportunity you have to really hit the 3+ card draw you want off this card. In a 4-player game, you're having to keep your eye on 3 different players' hand counts. Not only that, but there are more factions in the game. The more factions there are in the game, the more chance there is that one of those pairings plays a lot of cards and maybe they don't have much card draw, and they have a pretty average or low hand size all of the time. So the lower the player count, the better this is, and you have much more potential to play this for a more optimal effect. Ultimately though, it is quite a strong draw card, and you'd either be unlucky or desperate to play it for less than 3 cards. The other big one is Imperial Dragon, and this one is a card drawing machine. You just put it down on the most desirable base in play, and watch it draw cards. If your opponents choose not to play there, then this card is acting like an overrun from the zombies, and that may be hurting your opponents in the long run. Unlike in the Dragons though, where you can spread multiple Imperial Dragons out as well as cards like Ruins to funnel your opponents onto certain bases in order to guarantee draw, you only have one in the All-Stars, which is certainly less potent. We've already seen Puck, which is a power 3 guaranteed draw 1 if you want to. You realistically want to be aiming for at least 3 draws off Imperial Dragon to consider it a very strong card, and I think that is fairly achievable. In a 2-player game you cover 1/3 of the bases in play. Your opponent will inevitably have to play into it at some point, especially if you're working your way up to an unanswered 4 or 5 victory points. In multiplayer you're covering a smaller proportion of the bases in play, but as soon as it looks like you're creeping towards breaking the base, unopposed, everyone else will pile in to compete for the placements. So even if you didn't realise the card draw immediately from Imperial Dragon, I think it's fairly safe to call it a power 3, draw 3 cards at some point. You could potentially call them a strong for card draw, but I think a medium here is fair. Burst, and this is another one that you can make the case for moving up a level, and I was pretty close to doing that. I've actually talked about Sprout and Ghostly Arrival in the last tier list video. Sprout is an excellent support minion that works way better in the All-Stars than it does in Killer Plants. Generally, your power 3s are better than your power 2s, your power 4s are better than your power 3s, and the King minion is the best of the lot. So using your lowest tier minion to help move you up the power tree is a great trade-off. And you have much better power 3 minions in the All-Stars. We've just seen the Imperial Dragon for instance. Sprout is basically another out to getting the Imperial Dragon into play early, which is what you want to be doing. Ghostly Arrival is the main burst card on the screen here, a completely unrestricted extra play, and it really is an amazing card. It's the card that single-handedly enables my all-time favourite play, but more on that at the end. Finally, the Gelf, another great support minion, here to search out strong on-play abilities from your partner faction. It works great with partners like Vigilantes for example, where you can retrieve the exact Vigilante you want for that situation. In terms of burst though, what do we actually have here? Sprout and Gelf are the reasons I'm holding the All-Stars back in weak. While they do give you extra minion plays, and in theory you could combo them together, or with Ghostly Arrival for a significant burst play, the reality is you're never doing that. They're support minions to tutor for other specific minions to get your game plan going. The Gelf, for example, will sometimes replace 4 power with 3 power, and that's not really burst. Similarly, for the Sprout, it's often a net gain of 1 power. It's not to say that they're bad cards, certainly not, but they're not really used for burst plays like Ghostly Arrival is. Control now, and this is an easy one for the All-Stars. Seeing Stars is an incredibly thematic card for the faction, and it's just solid. There's not really much to say here, it's a nice extra effect in the toolbox support faction, but it is only 1 card and it's an easy week. Power Gain next, and this one I think is a fair rating. Lab Assistant is a nice power 3, a pseudo power 4 drop if you do have another minion in play, which aside from the first turn that's almost guaranteed to be the case. The +1 power counter is nice. Every time you increase your power on a base without actually adding more cards there, then that is very efficient. In addition, the power counter can help to move a minion out of controlling effects. It's a nice fair card. Full Moon, this isn't an earth-shattering card by any means, but it's just a solid power gaining effect to help break a base or secure first place. The All-Stars aren't necessarily a swarm faction, but like a lot of their cards they have something for everything and they can play into a partner faction's style of play. Favourite Dionysus is arguably the weakest card in the faction. While the +1 temporary buff for free as you do get the action back is nice, unless you're putting it on the top of the deck to draw again, it's an incredibly weak card. The issue is that this is the All-Stars and not the Mythic Greeks, so you really don't want to be drawing into this card again as the All-Stars can't really use this card like the Greeks can. If you place it on top of the deck, you reduce the number of new cards you draw at the end of every turn by 1, and it's a very weak card. Action enabling now, and this is one that I had to really think about as to whether it was a strong or a maximum. Wizards are the archetypal maximum action enabling faction, but I don't necessarily think it's fair to say that if a faction doesn't have as many extra action plays as the Wizards, then they can't be considered a maximum. If the All-Stars had 1 more extra action play, then they would have been a slam dunk for me, excuse the pun, but as it stands they're borderline and I settled on maximum. They've got 5 unrestricted plays, and it's Astounding which has to play the action from the discard pile. The All-Stars will regularly play an extra action in their turn, and they can easily chain more than 1. One of the strongest plays you can make is to play non-infinite loop to play Ghostly Arrival, to then play Ghostly Arrival again, before finishing with It's Astounding to play Ghostly Arrival 1 final time from the discard pile for a huge power swing turn. And that is maybe making me want to go back and change the burst rating for the faction to medium. It is one potential play though, and I'd say you're unlikely to do that. You may have better targets for both non-infinite loop and It's Astounding, and there is only 1 copy of each card, so lining it all up together is quite difficult. Because I've maybe been generous here with a maximum rating, I think that does balance out possibly being harsh with a weak rating for burst. Disruption, and just the 1 card here in the Ensign, but what a great protective effect this is on a power 2 body. Protection for one of your other minions from anything is absolutely incredible, and you can use this to protect your king minion or another high value target. It's disruptive because it is universal protection for another minion, but it's very weak as a disruptive card and barely even scrapes a weak rating here. 3 strong recovery cards here for the All-Stars, with the option to get any 1 minion and any 1 action back from the discard pile and put it to the top of your deck. It's Astounding is the next step up and allows you to replay an action from the discard pile. I've said previously that the order goes replay directly from the discard pile, then it's return to hand, then it's top of the deck. So 3 good recovery cards here, again which support any partner faction but aren't really dependent on partner faction. You do have 2 premier targets in King Rex and Ghostly Arrival with these cards, so you can derive a lot of value from within the faction itself. It's only 3 cards though, so medium is fair. The All-Stars have no plays in Phase 3, and no way of scoring victory points independently of bases. It should come as no surprise from my break in the All-Stars series that I think the All-Stars are a fantastic faction, and they've been very well put together. I think they're medium difficulty because they do have many extra plays, as well as card draw, so there is a lot going on. In addition, with 20 unique cards, there isn't necessarily a coherent theme within the faction, whereas unlike if you pick up something like the Mad Scientists, there are fewer unique cards and it's easy to tell at a glance what they're trying to do. Finally, for possible pairings, this is really tough because the All-Stars pair well with almost anything. I can't think of anything off the top of my head that the All-Stars wouldn't improve, and that the faction wouldn't appreciate. For this reason, it's difficult to say what the optimal pairing is for the All-Stars. I don't think I've ever picked the All-Stars and thought what would go well with them. I've always picked something else and thought they'd appreciate what the All-Stars can offer. So I'm going to go out on a limb and say that there isn't an optimal partner for the All-Stars, but that the All-Stars are an optimal partner for other factions, if that makes any sense whatsoever. I will just highlight one of those pairings. I mentioned this in the first tier list video, and that is the Dinosaurs, and this pairing provides my all-time favourite smash up play, and it's simple but so incredibly effective. You play King Rex, you play Ghostly Arrival, you play King Rex, you play Rampage, and you solo base break a 21 power base with just 4 cards. Throw Favour of Dionysus into the mix as well and you can up it to a 23 power base. Simply amazing. So here we have it. This is where the factions rank on the tier list. And we have 3 S tier factions, and I know that a lot of people would have Geeks up in the double S tier as one of the best factions ever made, but what you have to remember with the Geeks is that they're very, very good at stopping other players from winning the game, but they're not really very good at winning the game themselves. And that for me is why I don't hold them in quite the same esteem as others do. Penguins are here for almost the opposite of Geeks. With Crazy Draw and Burst winning the games very quickly, they're almost the antithesis of Geeks. Finally, the All-Stars, if you put them in the A tier, I wouldn't disagree with that. They flip between the two depending on how you personally rated some of those close characteristics, but they're really here as the premier support faction. And Sheep, well, I mean, they're not even in the same league as the others. So let's add them to the overall tier list, and it's really starting to flesh out now for both the faction and the average expansion rating on the right hand side there. So what do you think of these factions in the tier list so far? Which expansion would you want to see next? Let me know down in the comments below, and with that being said, I'll see you all next time. Goodbye.